Welcome. This is 24-Hour Nation. Through its website, social media, podcasts, and webinars like this one, 24-Hour Nation provides news and information for nighttime advocates and adventurers. My name is Randall White. Today's program is Sydney Unlocked, how Sydney's nightlife rebounded from lockouts and lockdowns. Now, without dwelling too much on history, context may be needed here that will help cities around the world better understand how to respond to adversity and well-intended thinking when it comes to the nighttime economy, which includes more than just nightlife, I might add. Like every other city in the world that has had or has a vibrant nighttime economy, the city of Sydney was clobbered by the coronavirus pandemic. Businesses were shuttered, stay-at-home orders were issued, and we all became socially distant. We'll refer to that as the lockdown, okay? Prior to that, however, and perhaps not as widely known around the world, in 2014, the government of New South Wales introduced legislation designed to reduce alcohol-fueled violence in some of Sydney's more popular nighttime destination districts. No new patrons could enter bars and clubs after a certain point of time. They were locked out. And then alcohol service hours were also shortened. We'll refer to that as the lockouts, okay? So both the lockdown and the lockouts dealt quite a blow to Sydney's nightlife, tourism, and its reputation as a vibrant and safe space, especially after the incredibly successful 2000 Sydney Olympics. Today, however, local, state, national, and international opinion falls in line with a recent headline I read in The Guardian. It said, Sydney's nightlife is the best it's ever been. So, how has this changed? What happened? What was learned? I sound like Pee Wee Herman. What has been the role of the music in this transformation? And what are the takeaways that can help you in your work in your city? Those are the questions we're going to explore. You'll hear from two panelists, two experts, and we'll have time at the end of the hour to respond to some of your questions. Now, before I introduce our guests, a shout out, please, to James Holm and Gabrielle Griffiths in the office of the 24-Hour Economy Commissioner for the Government of New South Wales, which I've learned we just call the 24-Hour team. Thank you both for your assistance. Now to our panelists. With a background as a musician, promoter, marketer, and event organizer, since 2015, Emily Collins has been the managing director of Music New South Wales, the primary organization, advocacy, or peak body, as they say in Australia, for music, musicians, and music venues in that state. Hello, Emily.
Hi, Randall. How are you going?
Good. Thank you for joining us. At one time a lawyer, then managing director for the publication Time Out Australia, and also the founding chair of the Nighttime Industries Association in Australia. Michael Rodrigues is the first 24-hour economy commissioner for the government of New South Wales. Hi, Michael.
How are you today, Randall?
I'm perfect. Thank you for joining us, both of you. We're so glad to have you here. As I've communicated, I think to you, Sydney was instrumental in my attention and involvement in the whole nighttime economy movement and managing some similar situations to the lockout laws that you are having in that state. We were having them in the city where I live, and this is what woke me up to the whole movement and to your work now. So I'm going to start with you, Michael. In the 2 years you have been the 24-Hour Economy Commissioner, what are a couple of moves or achievements that you have helped make happen that have strengthened Sydney's current outlook and that you feel are important and replicable in any part of the world? And what might be helpful would be say, here are the takeaways, this, and this, and then we go back and dissect them. Tell us what you want us to know.
Yeah, I guess there's in the context of just three things. The first is really how we work with industry and within government. So as part of the strategy, there's a 24-hour economy industry advisory group. And so that's part one. And like the byline on that is that 24-hour economy, nighttime economy, there are so many stakeholders. And so a big chunk of this is just really stakeholder management, engagement, understanding. So that's kind of one of those pieces of the puzzle that I think is pretty important. So that's kind of item number one. Item number two, I think, was in a bizarre way the pandemic and our response to it. So up until that point, I guess we had a theory on how to, revitalize the city based on the 24-hour economy strategy, which was a jointly produced document strategy piece. But the pandemic came along and kind of had jump-started the work of the office, really. And the strategy was then used as a revitalisation strategy for the CBD of Sydney. And so we ran a significant program based on the principles of the 24-hour economy strategy. And I guess we're not alone in the world in having run revitalisation programs. And it's hard to know whether ours has been more effective than others. But what I would say is that the principles of how we administered the funding and use those structures that we put in place may have been unique. So that's item number two. And the third is, I guess, where we find ourselves now, which is in core delivery of the strategy, which really is about good going out districts, decentralized all across Greater Sydney, each of which tells a unique and different story. And as I will say often here, if you can't make a story out of 60,000 continuing years of our traditional custodians, out of beaches to mountains, out of the most multicultural city on the planet or one of them, then we're not doing something right. And so the question is, how do you do it? And we're in the midst of a program called Uptown, which goes around putting in what I call soft infrastructure. It's the collaboration networks at local level that assist with cultural storytelling and place experience.
Well, so let's dive in first to your first point about management of all the stakeholders that are involved in the 24-hour economy. What lessons have you learned from that, or what have you bumped up against it? So every city that's doing this right now, particularly if they're doing, in many cities around the world, there's an internal person in the municipal government or the state government. And in some cities, there's, particularly in Europe, there's an outside entity, a nonprofit organization, non-government organization, it's also an advocate. That's a lot of hands in the pot. How do you manage that, Michael?
Yeah, so I guess like in your opening, you kind of set some of the landscape, and I'll just make a general observation to frame up, I guess, all this discussion. And in terms of quickly implemented policy decisions to stem alcohol fuel violence, or the response to any crisis is to meet it with an over response. And so I just sort of make that point at the outset. And the question then is, do you get a good outcome from that? And I don't think you necessarily do. And our experience here was that we didn't. So I just sort of say that at the outset because it's black or white or grey, somewhere in the middle. Then if you think about the number of participants in the going out experience, from transport providers through to entertainment providers, F&B and so forth, everyone's got their own particular arrow to push and outcome they want out of it. But it's the sum of all of it that gives rise to consistent, safe, economic, citizen amenity, positive outcomes over a long period of time. And so I think that the degree to which you understand the complexity of this ecosystem, and then make sure that that all in all of its complexity, it is represented and around a forum or group or whatever, the better your outcome will be. So if I go through our industry advisory group structure, and one of the learnings is you need a lot of patience and a lot of ability to listen. But we have three levels of government here. I'm at state, which is the central government, and at state level, there's about 10 government departments, all of whom have an impact on going out, from police, health, transport, planning, and so forth. So, and within those, there's probably about 20 teams in total. So what's the representation for that group? We have 128 councils across Greater New South Wales and 34 across Greater Sydney. So what's the representation for that group? And then lastly, when you look at the industry component, what is the industry? EDM, music, comedy, F&B, theatre, arts, culture, it's travel, like the industry representation piece is significant as well. So I guess that is the makeup. So it's not only understanding, it's then empowering all of those voices and having, touch points. And we aren't doing a perfect job here. I also want to say that at the outset, but over time, as the structures land, you get to focus on who isn't being represented, who do we need to hear more from, and go after a particular subset. And I think that's where we find ourselves now.
Are you kind of this shuttle, is a shuttle diplomacy that you go back and forth between all of these stakeholders and the government entities to make sure that voices are heard both ways? Is that part of your job?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one of the challenges in the role, in that as we all know,
Right.
you don't find our cultural leaders and night owls based in fluorescent tubing in government offices. Like, this is just, and even if you did, you're not going to get uh, their point understood, because it's not their natural environment to communicate, roundtables and the like. So I think delving into the dark corners of the city, and so engaging with people in a way that allows you to understand them and they can communicate what it is they need is pretty important. And I guess one of the challenges with the role, and then taking that information and translating it through to whichever part of the network you need to communicate. So, for example, it's not uncommon for me to say, I think what I understand you mean is, you think that it would be better that we have more appropriately tailored controls around X, Y, and Z, as opposed to, so and so sucks. Like, it's this kind of chief translator role that I guess I'm asked to play, and I get partly people like Emily and others who are on the advisory group to assist me in mastering those dialects as needed.
I see. Well, and that's probably, that's always the hardest part. I know that somebody came up out of the nonprofit sector of managing all of those voices and those interests, and that's really sometimes the hardest part. So congratulations on that. I want to talk a little bit about your number 2 point. You talked about the nighttime strategy document, with the 72-page document. I guess it is that it's a beautiful document. It's well articulated. I have it posted on the 24-Hour Nation website in our resources library, so that anybody can go look at it, download it. Was that one of the ones that was produced in partnership with EY?
No, so the strategy document was, I guess, a precursor to that collaboration network that now sits with me in the industry advisory group. So prior to the incarnation of the office, an area of government led a strategy process, but engaged pretty much those stakeholders. And we've ended up with a document that I think is a great North Star. The principles in it, I think, are, I don't want to say universal, but I think that they make sense outside of the context of Sydney. The detailed actions, I think you might need to look at your own city to work out what it is you need to do in those frameworks. But and it isn't necessarily, as everyone loves to say, rocket science. Like, but there is a degree of complexity, and implementation of it is really the thing that I think is a question mark, and how well you can implement something like that, because, as I've said, all the nuances of the individual sectors. So going back to that CBDs program we ran, we insisted on collaboration as a component of the criteria, and said, rather than funding an individual, we'll fund a collective. What does that collective look like? Well, it should be place-based. It should be people doing what they're good at. And, I'll probably offend some of your listenership here. But one thing that's occurred to me is that, the oftentimes governments rush to, and we need to fund artists, for example, for various things, but funding them for what they do and what they're good at makes more sense than funding them for things that they're not good at. And one of those things is producing a major event or an activation. That's a skill set, and the funding can be thought through how it flows and who it empowers. And so, I think that in our case, we looked at it and said, well, we've got local councils, we've got government agencies, we've got industry. Why don't we ask for collaboration and really specify the strength of criteria, and then say the money needs to go and pay local artists in your area, and you'll be held accountable for that. But rather than, but that's how major activations, for example, work. That's how venues work, etc.
Well, and your third point you spoke about the Uptown project, which just announced last week or something, and it kind of segues nicely into the last question I want to ask of you. What are you doing now? What's up your sleeve? What are you about to happen? But tell us a little bit about the Uptown project and how it's being implemented. And this is with state funds, New South Wales funds.
Yeah.
Tell us
Yeah,
about
so I guess it's a forever project uptown in a sense, and we've got the first iteration done, which I guess we ran as an accelerator, actually a capacity building exercise. So no government funding around that, but just all the skills that one needs to think about a local area, what story it wants to tell, what's its vision, who needs to help tell that story, how do you collaborate, and so I guess the first part was capacity building. The second part is the funding is made available basically to where the failure point of all that is, which is who's going to do the running, and oftentimes people have ideas. This is what needs to be done. I'm like, that is great news. Who is going to do it? And this is where you're met with stony silence often, because the reality is that I say daily, like if you can spot a problem, congratulations, you're 99 out of 100 people who can. Are you the one person who will take that one on and do it? If we want a vibrant city and we want to tell that story to the world, you need people to step up and do it. And those people need to be remunerated for that effort in some way, other than just as for societal good. Everyone needs to eat and so forth. So our funding is being directed into what I call the failure point of this theory, which is the coordination and engagement piece. Everyone rushes to fund major events because it's a quick fix. It makes us feel good. It says, oh, look at that. Here's a photo, here's social media, and the city's alive for about 6 hours during that event. And then it goes back to sleep. What you want is always on engagement by the city by its citizenry. That's what we're talking about, actually. And that is good. The hard news there is, do you want it? Do the work. And so part one of Uptown is really to establish those structures, fund it. And then I think I just really want to mention briefly, Randall, the Purple Flag scheme that we've
yes, we do. Yeah.
Licensed and are piloting here. Those uptown districts are essential, because what that allows for is placement of flags. In a sense, it's the mound on which the flag can be placed, if you like, and it doesn't need necessarily to be through a district formed through Uptown. It can be through other collaboration networks, but it's definitely a way for us to ensure that we've got a pipeline of well coordinated, well loved areas that bring together at a local space those participants that are relevant to it across those levels of government I mentioned, industry and council. And so the Purple Flag scheme, I love to cite it this way: you go to the beach, it's safe to swim because you see flags. A good going out district should have a flag. In this case, it's a Purple Flag scheme. And so that's kind of like the proof of concept of the strategy in a way.
Right.
And obviously doing it in a way that it sort of becomes self-sustainable and people see the value in these things, and it produces economic outcomes for venue owners and great societal outcomes for patrons and visitors, is where, and that's a 3 to 5 year exercise really to understand whether or not it's worked. But we are at year 2, and I'm pleased to say we're nearly there on piloting the scheme.
Well, that's terrific. The Purple Flag program, for many people in Europe, will know what it's about. Many people now in Australia will know what that's about. It's not necessarily as well known in the States. There is in Canada, there's kind of a safe bar program that's similar, and actually in Dallas, we've initiated a program here that's also the same line of a Purple Flag, although it's business specific rather than council district specific, which makes a lot of sense. I look forward to seeing Purple Flags all over Sydney. That'll be terrific. Okay, let me turn over to Emily a bit. Same question of you. Your work since 2015 at Music New South Wales, you have a very robust website. I love how it is promoting music and musicians. But tell us about 2 or 3 strategies or activations you've had, and then we'll go back and dissect them in terms of things that somebody might go, oh, I never thought of that. Oh, I could do that. I can help make that happen here. What would those be, Emily?
All right. Thanks, Randall. So 8 years is a really long time. That's how long I've been in this role, and a lot can happen in that time. So I'm just going to quickly try and distill, I guess what I'd call like Sydney's journey into 3 key lessons and give you a few examples of what we've been through. And we've been through a lot. So as you explained, Randall, the lockouts were pretty devastating to our industry. They were introduced in 2014. And they kickstarted what I'd call a bit of a difficult decade for music in Sydney. So the introduction, the lockouts felt like an attack on the music industry. And the trouble was that they impacted our journey in ways we didn't really understand at the time. Specifically, it turns out that when you spend years talking about how bad regulation has killed your industry, people start to believe you that your industry is dead. And that decimates business confidence, it decimates creative confidence, audience confidence. And really what happened, I think, is that our reputation and self-identity as a dull, boring nanny state became an even bigger threat than the lockout regulation itself. So the outlook was pretty dire. And, I kept saying this thing, every time you say Sydney is dead, you kill it just one little bit more. And so for me, that really first lesson that I think I learned, and I know a lot of my colleagues learned, was that how you talk about your city, how you talk about your nightlife, your people, your creative community, the language you use really, really matters. But, the thing is, the lockouts weren't actually an attack on the music industry. Like Mike said, it was just knee-jerk regulation that had unintentional impacts, born mostly from a lack of understanding about the music industry and nightlife in general. Government didn't have any idea how we work, our business models, who was employed in our industry, how much late night culture impacted businesses operating in other times of the day, interconnectedness with tourism and hospitality,
Right.
or just our incredible contribution to the economy and the everyday lives of people. So I think this lack of understanding, while not intentional, really characterizes much of the relationship we had with government over the last 10 years. And a pretty good example of this lack of understanding is from 2018, when we had a number of very tragic drug-related deaths at music festivals, which led to government introducing some fairly punitive legislation around festival operations, making it quite difficult to viably run a festival. They didn't take into consideration that festivals know festival goers best. And if you want to introduce health and safety regulations to make festivals safer, maybe you should include festivals in that conversation to make sure it's effective and viable. Funny that.
Whoa.
Yeah, so it felt a bit like another attack on the industry, and it kind of hit a nerve, I think, in a way that we'd had lockouts for 5 years by this time, or 4 and a bit years, so it really kind of hit a nerve. And the industry and audiences rallied around festivals. And a campaign called Don't Kill Live Music got a petition with over 160,000 signatures, and 15,000 people came to a rally in the city centre. Festivals, with the support of my organisation, came together and established their own voice called the Australian Festival Association, to ensure that they had an official representative voice to take to government. It was also conveniently, yet perhaps not surprisingly, right before a state election. The campaign garnered a lot of interest and elevated music as one of the top issues, which had never happened before, particularly during the time of the lockouts. So with real collaboration, the regulation was amended, and we managed to establish in legislation a music festivals roundtable, which required government representatives from health, police, licensing, etc., to show up and talk to festival representatives. And 5 years later, that roundtable still exists. So it wasn't a total victory. There's still issues with the regulation, but it was a massive step in the right direction.
All right.
And so for me, like, lesson 2 is that collaboration and organization from industry is essential.
Okay.
And this was really what I would call, like, the first real win for our industry, not specifically because of that regulation, but it was evidence that working together was possible and hugely impactful. And it felt like a turning point in the difficult decade for music. That was until COVID-19. which, like much of the world, we went into lockdown. There were restrictions, which were important, but also had pretty disastrous impacts on the live entertainment industry. In particular, density rules around how many people per square meter were allowed in venues put real limits on financial viability. So even once we were out of the strict lockdown, many venues weren't able to viably open their doors. It would cost them money instead of make them money. So, you know, a lot of our live music spaces were quickly amassing debt and looking at closing. So in September of 2020, I worked with over 80 music venues from across the state to argue for what was essentially a bailout. Without government support, we were set to lose vital, irreplaceable live music infrastructure. Sydney is, I think, currently ranked like the 10th most expensive city in the world. And much of that expense is to do with property prices. So if a venue closed its doors, it wouldn't be replaced with a new one. You know, it really meant that once they closed for good. So a group formed called SOS New South Wales, which is Save Our Stages New South Wales. And they started, I guess, campaigning for their saviour. The venues worked really well together, normally competitors. They came together with Music New South Wales as like the neutral coordinator to argue for their existence. And, you know, we got like confidential financial data and put together a business case. We explained tediously the value of live music venues and how much they impacted the entire music ecosystem. We explained the difference between small venues and 2,000 capacity rooms. We explained that music was essential to what would be, you know, economic recovery, that they would need us in the future. You know, we wrote treasury bids and we ran an online parliamentary petition. We called and met with ministers, shadow ministers, independents, anyone we could think of to argue our case. And we were told no several times. Because, you know, of course, our industry wasn't the only one being impacted. Right. Many businesses were in trouble. And historically, with the same government that had implemented the lockouts, we knew it was pretty unlikely that we'd get financial support because we didn't feel like we were valued as part of, you know, the cultural and economic landscape. But we didn't give up.
That's changed, hasn't it?
It has. But
has that been a political change in the elections?
Well, I think actually COVID was, you know, the silver lining of COVID, like many have said, is that it forced industry to work together, but it also forced government and industry to work together. You know, we had access to government ministers in a way we'd never had before COVID, because they were listening and open to sort of hearing our experience. So that was really important. And through that process, you know, we made friends with government. We built relationships. We had a lot of allies within government working to make sure that our pleas were heard. And so, you know, like after 9 months, we got the $24 million we were asking for. And it was a bailout package just for music venues. And I think it's sort of hard to explain how crucial this was because, you know, that historically there'd never been an investment like this before. Right. I think a lot of the music community felt like they weren't valued. And so, you know, this demonstrated, yes, government wants to have, you know, values music venues and doesn't want to see you disappear. So it really did sort of change, I guess, the perception of our relationship with government. So that third lesson for me is really like persistence is essential and make friends with.
Well, I have to agree with you. So basically how you talk about your nightlife and how you talk about your music scene is incredibly important because you brand it. Each time you give it the negative energy, then that just builds upon the negative energy. Second point is collaboration is possible, is necessary, is perhaps untapped in the whole music scene, and that be persistent as possible because that's where the change happens, and hopefully where the sustainable change will happen, because we're still facing problems. We're still facing problems in this world, and so that's very helpful. Thank you, Emily. I'll have some questions of both of you. I'm going to spend a little time here asking you both questions, but I ask anybody who's watching, if you've got a question you would like to have asked, pop it into the question or chat box, and we'll get there. When I was telling Emily that I actually met her before when I attended the Global Nights conference in Sydney, whatever that was, during the lockouts. I was aware at that time that some of the nightlife in Sydney had been pressed out to outlying high streets, as they say in the UK. There was nothing like walking down, I think it's called Prince's Highway in Newtown, and feeling the energy from the clubs and shops and restaurants and the live music coming through the open windows. With the return of the central business district and the energy back into the nightlife districts that were, quote, problematic, has the outlying energy remained in some of the other councils, Michael?
Yeah, like I think Sydney's metro is quite big. So
Yeah.
you're talking at 50 kilometers squared from the coast. And so if you think about the impact of the pandemic, particularly work from home, because it's a big commuter city, what happened is it demonstrated that people can, aren't necessarily tethered to a desk.
Right.
And as a result, what's happened is the investment that people would otherwise make in the CBD of Sydney has been decentralized to local areas. And so it's almost like everything's had a bit of a facelift in Greater Sydney as a result. And the question then is that, and the CBD of Sydney, well, it lost a significant market share, which is why some of these programs have been very focused on elevating it again.
Okay.
So I think just at a top line, there's been one of the benefits is that it's rapidly decentralized, and the work from home or hybrid working model, what it's actually done is it's eaten into people's travel time, and in a good way, and that travel time is now being spent partly in leisure. And so the market's actually grown as a result of the pandemic. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's yet found equilibrium or it's been rebalanced, but the overall share of out-of-home entertainment, as I call it, because I always look at out versus in and think, well, my job is to grow the out economy, and so the overall thing's grown. The question is how does the city rebalance? How do operators rebalance? And I think in terms of the immediacy, like those districts and are the ones that you cited, and people know it well. It's M or Newtown. I think it's like it's going well, I would suggest, and more venues, later venues, and so forth. And as the regulatory support comes in, and tends to, support culture, support late night, you're seeing capital, which is the most important part, come in behind it and take up those opportunities.
That's fantastic to hear and encouraging. Emily, do musicians realize the value they have or the power they have or what they can do in terms of economic and cultural value of a place at night?
Yes and no. I think musicians and creatives in general often don't realize the power they have, not just to influence culture, but also to really help set trends and build economic districts and all those sorts of things. You look at how gentrification works, and often it's that first wave of creatives that moves in that really build a new area. And there's a lot of conversations about gentrification, but that's often the first wave. So yeah, I think it's not necessarily harnessed or a cognizant thing in how they operate, but I would say that the music industry in general is starting to step into its power a little bit around influence, at least in Sydney and New South Wales, realizing from experience over the last 10 years, just like the impact you can have, the influence you can have. And, politicians aren't silly. They see email databases of hundreds of thousands of people, and they know that it's something to be considered in how they make decisions moving forward. So I think there is a growing awareness around that power.
When it goes back to your collaboration point earlier, I think also our experience in Dallas, when we were facing a lockout and curfew that was being proposed by a local ordinance, our coalition included musicians and back of house restaurant workers. It was such a diverse coalition. We showed up at our municipal government offices with 300, 400 individuals. People can count, elected officials can count, and they saw the impact and the diversity of that. It wasn't just organizations, it was also individuals who were personally going to be affected by that. And that was profound. In your coalition, Michael, that your advisory council does, is it mostly organizations, or do you have individual representatives like a musician and like, I'm curious.
Yeah, like it's a bit of both. Like naturally, these things kind of get. And as you're talking, actually, I was thinking about the wider what is the lesson. You know, there's an element where this I find myself thinking, and that, and I don't want to say it's professionalism is the wrong word, but it's understanding how government policy and economics works and being represented in a professional way. When you ask the question of do musicians know their own power, well, they don't understand necessarily how to demonstrate that using the trademarks of government and politics and economics. That's the disconnect. So when you go to that industry advisory group, and I love them all dearly, but there is a significant representation from industry peak bodies, right. And because they're the professional end of the so-called professional end of the industry. And again, like I have a reputation for calling it as it is, and I'll say it here. Industry peak bodies are going to represent the interests of their industry. The clue's in the name, right? Now, they aren't there to represent the outcome of the state. And so if you have a situation where you have Goliath and David, then you've got a challenge, right? Because the stronger industry peaks are going to have more share of voice, etc., than the lesser industry peaks. And then if you flow through all the way to your point, which is are artists represented and so forth, well, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because who does an artist represent? Themselves or the wider industry? Are they thinking for themselves or for the? It's the same question ultimately. And so, I think that the role of individuals and professionals that you're describing is to really inform in an intelligent way based on their knowledge set. Now, that can be, and as I say, through the industry advisory group, over time, we've de-governmentalized it. So we've gone out and made sure that people like Sam Beck, who's known in the local industry here and globally, are on that. But, it's not necessarily, that's after a tap on the shoulder saying, hey, I think it would be good for you to apply. But yeah, there's how you go about this is I don't think there is a one solution, and I don't want to give your listeners or viewers the message that you need this and then rely on it, because I don't rely on it. I use it as one tool amongst many, and nothing beats going out yourself and sitting face to face with people in their environment. And I take both of those inputs and then try to execute the job.
Okay. Well, and I know like right now, Montreal is building an advisory council for the nightlife scene, and they're looking for a very diverse representation. It includes organizations as well as individuals and around the spectrum of nighttime entities, nighttime stakeholders, including, we pulled in the healthcare sector when we were talking in our community, because the healthcare workforce is huge at night in a city, a metro area like ours. How do your two organizations work together? And Michael, you're quote government, and Emily, you're a nonprofit, but I assume you receive some funds from.
We're essentially funded by state government to, provide services to the music industry, and also be that, I guess, intermediary between government and industry. And so a lot of my role is, trying to work both with government and industry and artists, to find and connect the dots. And I spoke a bit before about that, government having a lack of understanding about the music industry, but I think that works both ways. So the music industry having a lack of understanding about government, and that's really what my job is on both sides, is to help government understand industry and help industry understand government, and try and get them to meet in the middle some way. So I'm on Mike's advisory committee, and I've worked closely with the 24-hour office since its 2 years of existence, and I think it's a really collaborative relationship and it's great for me as a state music body to be involved in those broader conversations about nighttime, and meeting all those other players that I might not necessarily meet, because I'm usually just focused on government.
Gotcha. And Michael, from your perspective, the role of the music sector in the nightlife scene, how big of a priority is music for what you're doing?
Yeah, it's pretty significant. and just by like, if you think about the going out experience and percentages, if you want, like people go out and want to experience music, right, and dance. These are, and then at the other end, there's galleries and there's all the different types of experiences that comprise a market. And so I think, you know, and F&B, food and beverage, and music kind of tend to be up the top end of that. And then, and then it depends on, the city and the place as to other art forms and their relevance to audience. Really, that's the kind of key question. It's there's so I guess an element of policymakers and individual preference that comes into this, and I think it can be problematic because, as I often cite, if I had my way, the city every corner would have a whiskey bar. But that's my personal preferences. It's not like representative necessarily of all demographics and what they want to experience. And so I guess I think the question really is, and this is why this purple flag scheme is important, is the question is, can you get the balance right? I think that when you over concentrate an area with one type of art form or type of activity, you really need to think about what you're doing there. And it's if you take, for example, a cultural precinct that is high arts only, well, really what you're saying is we're not welcoming everybody who's not interested in this, right? So this diverse blend of things is something I think for policymakers to think about, not to prescribe it, but to create an environment where opportunity is possible, and then let the market decide. And I think that one of the things that I'm currently grappling with in my role is how much government intervention is too much. And I think that I'm putting the brakes on now, because it's really government, I think, should have a very light touch around prescribing entertainment, and that's true of music as well. Like it's who does that well? Private sector. Private sector does entertainment really well. Our job, my job specifically, is to help create the enabling environment for entertainment to happen within stated guidelines from government, and then step back and allow the sectors to to work out what that right mix is.
We need 50 of you in the United States, Michael. I just have to say that every state should have a you.
Watch out what you wish for, Michael.
One other question before I turn to some of we're getting a couple of questions coming in. I'll go to those here after this. It seems to me, and maybe I'm mistaken because I just see the narrative pop up on a lot of communication that comes out of Australian organizations, but it seems to me that inclusivity, diversity, and authenticity to the place and the history and the people of the place is very important now in Australia. And people often acknowledge that you are on land. In the States, we would say, I'm on stolen land that belonged to the people who were here first. How important is that also in the cultural scene, in the nightlife scene? How important is that representation, that diversity, that inclusion? You just mentioned something just now, Michael, about in the high arts districts to make sure that other things are not feeling excluded. So talk to me about that, both of you, about inclusivity and what you can do to help ensure that equity.
Do you want to go, Em?
I mean, yeah, I like it. It's incredibly important. We've had so many conversations in the music industry, and I'm just talking from the music context about how important visibility is and representation is, and particularly for our First Nations, artists and industry representatives. We need to make sure there's equity of access and opportunity within what we do, and that's not just having a First Nations artist on stage. It's also about making sure that that there's support for their manager and the back of house and people in the audience, and that there's diversity in all aspects of the industry. But really that representation is so key because there's a lot of conversations around you can't be what you can't see, and actually it makes people feel included in society in general with that visibility and representation. So from a music industry perspective, it's something we're like incredibly aware of and constantly trying to do better, and to make sure that there's leadership within First Nations communities to make sure that there's autonomy and self-determination around that whole process of representation as well. So yeah, it's highly, highly important.
From your
And
perspective, Michael?
it's not for like, I mean, it's not because it's not only it's the right thing to do, it actually will give you a better outcome, like for civic participation and economic uplift, if that's all you're focused on. I have sat on numerous forums where I've heard licensees, you know, chat, say things bad, etc. Because I can't trade at 4 or 5 in the morning. If you don't have vegan pizza and non-alcoholic beers on your menu, right, all you're doing is excluding a big chunk of a growing audience segment. Now, so in terms of the of diversifying and improving your offer and understanding cultural practice and trends, it's just good business. If you want to leave aside the other ethical issues and moral, and is it the right thing to do? And I think as I come back to it, and I've interpreted really this role in government as one as a publisher, really, with having run Time Out. It's not for me to tell the stories. It's for me to help create the platform and allow the stories to be told. And again, you have all the clans and nations across our great state. If we're not telling those stories, we're just missing a trick. And so, and it's genuinely interesting. It's so pleasing to see, right at this point of history. And the pandemic, I think, to some degree, has accelerated a lot of things. And I think generational change and a new cultural leadership is emerging in Sydney, New South Wales, as empowered by, the environment we find ourselves in. And so, I think it's one of those jobs that will never be done in my mind. And it's great that, the music industry, as an example, it is big, it is important. It can lead the way on these issues for other parts of the ecosystem to follow, who aren't necessarily as, in tune, or no pun intended, but also not necessarily as well resourced. And so shout out to colleagues like Em for the work that they do in this space.
Okay, that's what, and it's impressive. That was my impression of what was taking place in Australia and New South Wales and in Sydney. It's impressive. It's moving, and it's an aspiration, I think, for other countries around the world. So a couple of questions here that have come in. Let me ask this one of you both, perhaps. Which nightlife cities do you take inspiration from? Emily?
Well, I lived in Berlin for about 3 years, so
There you go.
I take inspiration from Berlin, but also Amsterdam. There's so many great European cities, and actually I just spent some time in Bangkok, which was incredible. I think there's so many other cities who have an incredible nightlife and such incredible things to offer. So yeah, I'm constantly inspired by the places I visit.
How about you, Michael?
Yeah, like I guess you in our roles, and it's great that you've arranged this today, Randall, and I think we need to learn from each other and what works and what doesn't. And I look at Asian cities mainly because of the changing demographic in Sydney, and we are in the next 10 years we'll be more Asian in terms of going out habits than we are Western ultimately. And the beauty of that is my people don't like going to sleep. We don't get up till like 10. We definitely don't go to sleep till 2 in the morning. So, in terms of that, it's more in tune actually with the way many Asian cities work, 24-hour economy thinking. And then I think, an areas for we need to think about and do better on is incorporating narrative that suits our place. Like, so oftentimes we look at London and New York, and we should, but as I always say, neither of them have beaches or a harbour of any note, and sorry, they have Manhattan, etc. There is of course water, but we like, it isn't Sydney. And how much are we thinking about our nightlife and how imagery from waterways and so forth is reflected? And this is one of the great things about our Aboriginal history, is that as we tap into this, you're starting to see more and more these storylines around our waterways because they are so important. So, I think that like cities that are coastal, etc., are ones that I also look at as much as the big smoke.
Okay, all right. Here's a question, and this comes up a lot in the discussion in the nighttime sector. It has to do with transportation at night. Does the new Sydney Metro automated train system run 24 hours a day?
That's a really good question. I don't think it runs 24 hours a day. But I guess the question more broadly is like, calibrating transport, to need, and can you do it economically is really what sits at the heart of it. And, it oftentimes you'll hear people say, oh, you should send transport 24 hours a day. Well, if you were to do that, the economic cost of it would cripple the state. Like, so, it is not, it is again, in the same way that government and politicians can be accused of knee-jerk reactions. That's
Right.
an industry having a knee-jerk reaction to a problem about doesn't understand. The real things that I'm focused on are late night transport for workers, and in the sector. So you got a travel shortage, a worker shortage. How's the late night economy working in particular, and then tailoring it to demand. And so there's a significant piece. Transport assets are significant. They are big systems that that require detailed understanding to recalibrate. And I think that the opportunity we have here is to really think about new modal and patterns, post pandemic, and try to use that as a way of saying, well, actually, this is what a more efficient use of transport is.
I think every city, I think every city that's got an active night scene, an active nighttime workforce is facing that same challenge. The guy that gets out of the kitchen at 3 a.m., 4 a.m. in most of the cities in the States, there's no public transport for him. So he has to drive his car, contributes to air pollution. Why aren't we thinking about that? Why is there, yeah, okay. Okay, this is a really great question. And I know who asked this. One of the big losses from Sydney's urban nighttime economy has been the nightclub, something that Sydney was famous for throughout the 90s and early 2000s. Licensing freezes, heavy policing, and the high cost of sound attenuation, another thing that's a big topic in all cities, have driven much of this loss. There's been a slight resurgence of late, but can you speak to any plans there are to bring back more nightclubs to the city?
Mike?
Yeah, like I think it goes back to what I was saying about creating the conditions. And so those very small shoots that we're seeing, I would say, like you understand, we really crippled it. We really crippled it here. The venue loss was something I don't want any city to go through ever. And so we're having to try and cultivate it back bit by bit at the moment. And so, but it is those wider economic environment conditions that really matter. So it's the attitude of government, it's the regulatory environment, and then the biggest lever, as I can tell you, is capital. And if capital comes into the market, it will solve some of those other issues. And so, if you look at like what's happening here, in our, I guess, areas that are starting to rejuvenate, there's significant capital in behind them, and I can hear people on the call going, well, what if you don't have money? I'm like, well, that's cool, because it's never be too proud to be first, to be second. Allow big capital to come in, put in place the framework, and then the smaller venues that can sit around those larger spaces will kind of, happen more organically, I would think. And this is, where we find ourselves on the journey. So in terms of the specific efforts, and it goes round back to some of those questions about the advisory group and does it work and whatever, I'm spending a significant amount of my time in that end of the scene, which aren't represented at these tables, making sure that they're talking to each other, because everyone's trying to solve the same problem without talking to each other. Again, which is, one of the failings of the sector. It's like you 10 people need to sit down, talk to each other, and curate empathetically, try and build little circuits in the city, and program in a way where you're not competing with each other. Like that's where the sector can be more clever. And so I think in terms of everyone rushes to, we need to invest money in it. It's like, well, yes and no. Like the as I say, this sector has significant commercial value and significant capital, and if the conditions are right, that money will come in and then support these venues. It's not to push sound and noise and all these other challenges under the carpet, policing, etc. We need to continue working on those, but it's just to understand that that you need all of those things to come together for it to genuinely be reestablished.
Sure.
I think it's also about trying to find ways to bring the underground into the above ground. Because and understanding the rationale and reasons why people do events that aren't necessarily within the traditional venue frameworks, and building relationships with those communities to better understand how we can make sure that those communities are supported, because they contribute so much to our social and cultural life, and it's really about trying to make sure that they are also supported to be economically viable and all those sorts of things. So yeah,
Seattle has done a pretty good job of that. I think they've reached into the nighttime rave scene and try to help usher more mainstreaming some of those that activity. It still happens in ways that I think many people don't know, that the club scene's still going on. You might just not be seeing it in a traditional club setting. Here's a great question that's very specific to Sydney, and I don't even know enough about it to be able to tell you even where this is. How can we better plan for the nighttime economy in Greenfield and new development areas of Sydney?
Greenfield sites.
Greenfield sites. Yeah. Sorry, that question threw me. I was like, I know Fairfield, I know other fields, I don't know Greenfield, but
so greenfield sites meaning,
new.
venues that don't have infrastructure necessarily. They're just sort of,
Oh, gotcha. There you go. Greenfield. Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah. I mean, it goes back to the discussion we were having right at the outset around the involvement of councils in particular. And so this, I put myself to sleep with some of this stuff, but I'll try. Like, for areas to become dynamic over a period of time, at least in our context, they need a few things. One is a strategy piece at a local council area that kind of segs with us, saying, well, yeah, we kind of want it too. Easier said than done, because you need a bit of local stakeholders, you need a bit of cash, you need political will, etc. at local level. And then there's a term of art, development control plans, which is deciding what goes where essentially in emerging areas becomes important. And councils that understand the program, 24-hour activity, should be more disposed to development control plans. They're really important for us as we have a new 24-hour airport coming into Sydney in 3 years. And particularly the 8 councils that have joined that, what extent are they thinking about and are planning for? It's all politics is local. You say 24-hour to some people and they're just like, I want to go to sleep, so there's a bit of this kind of and discussion that needs to happen, but that's kind of where it fits in the system. That's a joint effort between state and local councils in the first instance to try to create those conditions that I've talked about.
Okay. Well, and the next 2 comments are not questions, they're observations. One is there are huge changes in investments in transportation infrastructures across the greater Sydney metropolitan area, metro, light rails, you just mentioned the airport, improving different local government areas. I believe it takes time to improve the night connectivity transport, but these are all good signs. That's one observation. A resident of Sydney has said, and here's another, this comes from the UK, bravo. Bravo to you both and your teams. I just wish we in the UK had government officials like Michael.
And
there
Emily,
you go.
Quasi. Well, it's my role's a bit of an experiment. Both the nature of the role, but also me as someone in it. And I think I do going back to some of the examples that Emily mentioned. One of the big parts of my job is to be in advising government. It's people just think government one thing. There's 500,000 people in New South Wales government. I spend a lot of my time trying to educate people within the bureaucracy and ministerial offices on the nuances that a 100-person room is different to a 500-person room, to use Emily's early example. So I think that I'm not saying I'm perfect for it, but having someone that's had that experience and knows who to call to be informed and take in the right message, I think is one of the learnings I would hope that other economies look at.
Well, and again, my hat's off to you both, and to Sydney. I would like to thank you both and wish you a happy Valentine's Day. We're not quite there yet. We'll be there soon. This webinar will be posted on YouTube, our YouTube channel at 24 Hour Nation, in a day or so. We're getting some applause. That's great. We'll include the links to your web pages so people can learn more about what you're doing, and a couple of your publications as well, Michael. For our panelists and for those watching from New South Wales, if you are out and about at all this coming weekend, it sounds like Sydney World Pride is going to be an outrageously wonderful celebration, and another sign that Sydney is becoming the envy of the world, which is a good place to be. Finally, I thank you for joining 24 Hour Nation today. We have our podcasts and webinars, links to other webinars and conferences, downloadable library of resources, lots of things on our website. Go check it out. This is just what I do. And please check us out, 24hournation.com, or follow us online at 24 Hour Nation. Emily, Michael, a joy to spend time with you. My name is Randall White. Thank you and have a good day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Randall. Thanks, Em. Take care.
Bye-bye.